This Friday will mark 2 years since the Grenfell Tower fire. Despite calls in the aftermath for a new regulator to help improve living standards in social housing, new research shows conditions for many have yet to improve. Housing charity Shelter has also uncovered a deep lack of trust in the government to keep social tenants safe in their own homes. Sky's Charlotte Lomas reports.
Hi Michael.
Hello there.
Nice to meet you. Thank you for letting me come. Just show me around.
Okay.
What are the main problems that you've been having?
Michael Mahid has been living in this council flat for more than 30 years. In that time, he's had 4 major floods which destroyed parts of his home.
When I had the flood, which was in the downstairs toilet there, part of the problem is they didn't fix it for a long time because of the asbestos panelling. The council plumbers wouldn't do anything because it was asbestos. In the finish... How
long were you left like that?
Weeks.
With the flood?
With the flood, yeah. I was walking through it every morning.
As well as dealing with floods and asbestos, Michael says he has faulty electrics and subsidence. Michael, who used to work as a cleaner in the Houses of Parliament, says he struggles to get any help from the council and is one of many residents on this South London housing estate who've been making complaints. Karen Connolly won £4,000 in compensation from the council after she was exposed to asbestos. She now campaigns for her neighbours.
People are at their wits' end. They're scared, they're anxious, they're angry, yeah, but they're not listened to. That's the point, they're not listened to. People, and the whole complaints process for any kind of disrepair is harrowing.
According to the homeless charity Shelter, more than half of the people renting social housing in England have had a problem with their home. That's around 2.5 million people. And 1 in 10 of those have had to report that problem 10 times before it was looked at.
Councillor Kieran Williams from Southwark Council, who runs the housing estate, told Sky News, as the landlord of London's largest social housing stock, it's a mammoth task to manage our repairs in a timely way, and successive cuts by central government to council budgets have only made it harder. However, we always strive to deliver the very highest standards of service to our tenants. Almost 2 years ago, the Grenfell Tower fire exposed the failures of social housing in the UK and triggered calls for better regulation, which campaigners say hasn't happened.
Tenants were not listened to in Grenfell, and they are still not being listened to in social housing up and down the country, and they're acutely aware of that, and it's leading them to fear for their safety, which is hardly surprising given what happened at Grenfell. So what we really need is a new regulator that will hear tenants' concerns and follow them up and be accountable to tenants themselves.
People living in social housing are some of the country's poorest and most vulnerable. Campaigners are calling for urgent action to ensure they're safe in their homes. Charlotte Lomas, Sky News.
So what should be done to improve conditions? That's our talking point this morning. More from Westminster. We're joined by Labour's Jim Fitzpatrick, who's a former firefighter and the current chair of the Parliamentary Fire Safety and Rescue Group. And in the studio, Moyra Samuels from campaign group Justice for Grenfell. Welcome to you both. To you first of all, Moyra, 2 years on from Grenfell, what has changed? Do you think there have been improvements? Are you happy with any progress that has been made?
I think progress has been extremely sluggish. In actual fact, some people feel that it's so small and so slow that it's not recognised as any change at all. You know, whatever little changes that are introduced, we find that actually the clauses or sub-clauses mean, for example, banning cladding on new buildings in the future, but leaving out the retrospective or the buildings that exist at the moment, and that in itself creates new problems.
Jim Fitzpatrick, do you recognise the problems that Moyra is articulating there?
I do, and in respect of your last piece, this is not just confined to the social sector, it's also in the private sector, where built blocks with defective cladding or suspect cladding is not being addressed at all. And this came up quite clearly in the debate on Grenfell last Thursday in the House of Commons. Around 90% of the blocks which are social housing either are being done or have plans to be done. It's 90% who in the private sector are not being done. and 70 don't even have a plan. So there are people living in tower blocks in the social and the private sector who need urgent action to make sure that their homes are safe.
I mean, there will be people watching this just simply asking the question, why? Why is that the case?
Well, in the social sector, the government took nearly a year to come up with £400 million for housing associations and local authorities, which is why they are much further down the road to making sure people are safe in their own homes. It took nearly 2 years for the government to come up with £200 million for the private sector. Many private owners and private freeholders and developers are either dragging their feet or in complete denial. Some of them are hiding behind offshore titles. In some places, like the fire in Barking yesterday, residents don't even know who the ultimate owner of their blocks are, that they are renting or leasing. And in that instance, there isn't enough accountability, there's not enough transparency, and people need better than this. And that's why the Labour Party, through John Healey this morning, is putting out policy statements saying if the matter doesn't change quickly, then local councils should be able to fine those companies and ultimately confiscate those blocks to make sure that people are safe in their homes.
Moyra, the charity shelter spoke about the breakdown in trust in the government and the belief that the government can keep tenants, residents safe. How long do you think it would take, or what would it take, to have that trust rebuilt, or do you think that trust is completely gone?
I think it's very difficult because it's been systemic and it's been over a number of decades. I think it would take a change in legislation. It would take actually changes in some of the actual Housing Act aspects of it to actually make sure that tenants, especially social or council tenants, actually feel that they are as valued as any other tenant. And that's, that is quite a difficult issue, I think, unless we see legislative change, unless we see action. Because there's lots of, great announcements, but actually on the ground, implementation of that is incredibly slow.
Jim, is that really the key? I mean, there's been much talk, much discussion. We've had the fallout from Grenfell and the discussion around that. But is it just simply down to legislation? That's what needs to push forward change?
Well, it's obviously not just down to legislation. Moyra is absolutely right. There needs to be stronger regulation. There needs to be somebody who will oversee housing to make sure it is fit. The government are making a lot of the right noises. They issued a new consultation only last Thursday about a new regulator for the housing sector. That's another consultation. That's going to take another 2 months, with another couple of 3 months before we get a government response. Grenfell is 2 years ago, and we're still looking at what's going to be happening. Dame Judith Hackett produced her recommendations. Many of them have been implemented, so that shows that some things are being done. As I said, many blocks of flats in the social sector are being done and are now much safer than they were 2 years ago. But this is taking far too long, and people who are living in these blocks want to have the assurance that their homes are safe, or that there are plans in place and that they're safe in the interim until such times as the repairs and the improvements can be undertaken. Government have making the right noises, but we need to see more action. Moyra's absolutely right.
Well, let's get back to the people that are affected. You represent the people who are affected by Grenfell. What did they say to you about the current situation?
I think that the question of Grenfell is quite overwhelming. There's so many issues that the community, that the bereaved and the survivors are actually facing. If we think about it, 2 years on, there's still the ongoing issues with mental health. People are worried about the delays in the inquiry. People are residents who live there who were evacuated are wondering actually whether they're going to have permanent tenure, what's, security of tenure. I think there's a whole range of issues that actually Grenfell has thrown up about people's security and safety in their own communities.
Jim, just finally a point, you mentioned the idea of a new regulator that would be accountable to tenants. What sort of responsibility would you like to see that regulator having? What would you want to see from that role?
Well, there's a vacuum at the moment, and the government's consultation last week clearly says that they want representations about a new regulator to oversee the whole housing sector. The public inquiry into Grenfell may not actually report until 2021 or 2022. Dem Judith Hackett's interim report was out last year, and some actions have been taken. The government needs to move to improve the regulations in the housing sector, because Grenfell was a catastrophic failure of government regulation, of architecture, of design, of inspection and enforcement of the regulations. Somebody needs to be put in charge of that whole dimension to make sure people feel safe in their own homes. Government are making the right noises, but we need to see action sooner rather than later.
OK, Jim Fitzpatrick and Moyra, thank you very much.